There are moments in history when a single person steps outside the rules of their time so completely that even centuries later, the world still struggles to understand them. Tonight's story is about one of those people, a woman born into scandal, raised in silence, and pulled toward the sea long before she ever touched the deck of a pirate ship. Her name was Anne Bonny, and in the brutal, lawless waters of the Caribbean, she would become one of the most feared and mysterious pirates of the Golden Age of Piracy. But before the legends, before the pistols, the black flags, and the infamous partnership with Calico Jack, there was only a restless girl standing near the edge of a harbor, watching ships disappear beyond the horizon, and wondering if freedom existed somewhere out there beyond the waves. What makes Anne Bonny's story so dangerous is not just that she became a pirate, it's that she rejected the entire world that had been planned for her. In the early 1700s, women were expected to obey, marry quietly, and disappear into domestic life. Anne chose something else. She chose uncertainty, she chose rebellion, and eventually, she chose the sea. By the end of this story, Anne Bonny would stand shoulder to shoulder with hardened pirates, survive naval hunts, witness betrayals, and become part of a legend that still fascinates historians more than 300 years later. Yet the deeper you look into her life, the stranger it becomes. Some records contradict each other, some details were exaggerated by sailors and storytellers, and some parts of her life may never be fully known. But one thing is certain, Anne Bonny was real, and for a brief moment in history, she terrified an empire. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This documentary is created for historical education and entertainment purposes. Some scenes are dramatized based on historical accounts, maritime records, and documented pirate history from the early 18th century. Viewer discretion is advised due to references to violence, crime, and harsh historical realities of the colonial era. Welcome to Biographic Digest. Now lower the lights, settle in, and let's travel back to a world of storms, gunpowder, and restless oceans. Anne Bonny was believed to have been born around the year 1697 near Cork, Ireland, during a period when reputation controlled nearly every aspect of life. Society was rigid, deeply religious, and obsessed with status. Families protected their names carefully because a single scandal could destroy business connections, marriages, and social standing for generations. Anne entered that world already surrounded by controversy. According to several historical accounts, her father was believed to be William Cormac, a lawyer connected to the merchant class of Cork. Her mother, Mary Brennan, reportedly worked as a servant in his household. Their relationship was never intended to become public knowledge, but when Mary became pregnant, secrecy quickly became impossible. At the time, an affair between a respected lawyer and a servant woman was more than gossip. It threatened financial stability, inheritance rights, and church reputation. Stories spread quietly through the narrow streets and crowded markets of Cork. In a society where appearances mattered almost as much as wealth itself, the scandal placed enormous pressure on the household. Historians disagree on many details from Anne's early life, but most versions of the story agree on one thing. Her father eventually decided to leave Ireland entirely in search of a new beginning across the Atlantic. And so, while Anne was still a small child, the family crossed the ocean to the American colonies. The journey itself would have been exhausting and dangerous. Atlantic crossings in the early 1700s were brutal for ordinary passengers. Ships were crowded, food spoiled quickly, and storms could trap travelers below deck for days at a time. The air inside the lower cabins smelled of damp wood, salt water, sweat, and sickness. Water had to be rationed carefully. Disease spread easily, and every creak of the hull reminded passengers how fragile their survival truly was. For young Anne, the crossing may have been her first glimpse of the thing that would shape the rest of her life, the sea. When the family finally arrived in Charlestown, in the colony of Carolina, they entered a completely different world from the cold stone streets of Ireland. The air was heavy with heat and humidity. Marshes stretched along the rivers. Mosquitoes filled the evenings. Ships from England, the Caribbean, and Africa crowded the harbor, carrying rum, sugar, lumber, cloth, and enslaved people. It was a growing colonial settlement built on trade, ambition, and exploitation. For William Cormac, the colonies offered something priceless. Distance from the scandal back in Ireland, he rebuilt his career slowly, using his legal training to handle land disputes and contracts for local planters. Over time, the family established a more stable life outside Charlestown on a modest plantation property. To outsiders, they appeared respectable enough. The past remained buried across the ocean, but Anne never fully fit the role expected of her. Even as a child, she was described in later accounts as unusually independent and strong-willed. While other girls were taught domestic routines and proper manners, Anne preferred wandering near the docks, watching ships arrive from distant islands and foreign ports. Sailors fascinated her, so did their stories. Hurricanes in the Caribbean, Spanish treasure fleets, dangerous reefs, smugglers, privateers, hidden coves. The world beyond Carolina seemed larger and more alive than the carefully controlled society surrounding her. As Anne grew older, the gap between her personality and colonial expectations became impossible to ignore. Carolina society had strict rules for women of her class. A respectable young woman was expected to prepare for marriage, manage a household, and strengthen family alliances through careful social behavior. Stability mattered, reputation mattered, obedience mattered. Anne hated all of it. She learned practical skills easily enough: riding horses, managing chores, reading basic texts, helping around the plantation. But she showed little interest in becoming the quiet, controlled woman society expected her to become. Several later stories described her temper as fierce, though historians caution that some tales were likely exaggerated over time by writers fascinated with pirate legends. Still, even if half the stories were embellished, one truth remains consistent across historical descriptions. Anne Bonny was restless, and the older she became, the more dangerous that restlessness started to look. The port of Charlestown only intensified those feelings. Every week, new ships arrived carrying sailors from across the Atlantic world. Merchants discussed wars in Europe. Captains spoke about the Bahamas, Jamaica, Cuba, and the growing pirate activity spreading through the Caribbean after the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. That war had changed everything. For years, governments had hired privateers, legal raiders authorized to attack enemy ships during wartime. But once peace treaties were signed, thousands of experienced sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed. Many had spent years fighting at sea and had no interest in returning to poverty on land. Some accepted low-paying merchant jobs, others turned to smuggling, and many became pirates. The Caribbean was entering the height of the Golden Age of Piracy. Nassau in the Bahamas was becoming infamous as a pirate stronghold, where escaped sailors, former privateers, smugglers, and opportunists gathered far from direct imperial control. Rumors spread constantly through colonial ports, merchant ships disappearing, pirate crews dividing treasure equally among themselves, captains elected by vote instead of noble birth, entire crews rejecting the rigid social systems of Europe. To most respectable colonists, those stories represented chaos and criminality. To Anne Bonny, they sounded like freedom. Her father noticed the change in her long before he understood how serious it had become. Anne spent increasing amounts of time near the harbor, listening to sailors instead of attending social gatherings. Suitors from respectable families failed to interest her. Conversations about marriage only pushed her further away emotionally. William Cormac likely believed this rebellious phase would eventually pass. It did not. Instead, the tension inside the household grew stronger with every passing year. Anne had already experienced what happened when society rejected someone for failing to follow its rules. Her entire childhood had been shaped by the scandals surrounding her birth. She had watched her parents flee across an ocean to rebuild their reputation from nothing. Somewhere deep inside, she learned an important lesson very early in life. Respectability could disappear overnight, and once that illusion broke, fear lost much of its power. By her mid-teens, Anne spent more time imagining escape than imagining a future in Carolina. The plantations felt suffocating, the church gatherings felt performative, the endless conversations about land, inheritance, and status felt painfully small compared to the horizon waiting beyond the harbor. At night, she sometimes walked near the docks alone, just to watch the lanterns hanging from anchored ships. The sounds stayed with her long after she returned home. Ropes creaking in the wind, waves striking wooden hulls, sailors laughing somewhere in the darkness. The distant feeling that entire worlds existed beyond the boundaries of colonial society. She didn't fully understand it yet, but the sea was already calling her, and soon, someone would arrive in Charlestown who would change her life forever. By the early 1710s, Anne Bonny had become increasingly difficult for colonial society to understand. To neighbors, she appeared intelligent but distant. To her father, she seemed stubborn beyond reason. And to the small circle of respectable families surrounding Charlestown, she was becoming a problem that needed to be corrected before gossip turned into reputation damage. In colonial Carolina, marriage was not simply about romance. It was business, survival, and social positioning all at once. Families built alliances through marriage. Land passed through marriage. Wealth expanded through marriage. A daughter who refused suitable matches threatened the long-term stability of the household itself. William Cormac wanted Anne settled into a respectable life before her rebellious behavior damaged the family's standing further. Anne wanted the exact opposite. The more she was pushed toward conventional society, the more emotionally disconnected she became from it. She attended social dinners when required, wore the proper dresses, answered polite questions, and followed expected etiquette just enough to avoid outright scandal. But internally, she was drifting further away from the world around her. What fascinated her instead were the stories arriving from the sea. The Caribbean during this period had become one of the most unstable regions in the Atlantic world. Merchant wealth moved constantly between colonies, creating enormous opportunities for piracy. Ships carrying sugar, tobacco, rum, silver, and manufactured goods crossed dangerous waters where law enforcement was inconsistent and naval patrols were limited. And Nassau, in the Bahamas, had become the center of it all. Former privateers, smugglers, escaped sailors, and outlaw captains gathered there under loose systems of self-rule. Some historians later described Nassau as a kind of pirate republic, though reality was far rougher and less romantic than later legends suggested. Violence, disease, and betrayal were common, but compared to rigid colonial hierarchy, the pirate world still carried a powerful image of independence. Anne absorbed every detail she could. She spent increasing amounts of time near taverns along the docks where sailors exchanged stories over cheap rum and exhausted laughter. The air inside those places smelled of salt water, sweat, tobacco smoke, and spilled alcohol. Lantern light flickered across rough wooden walls while sailors argued about storms, prizes, and rumors from distant islands. That was where Anne first encountered James Bonny. Unlike the dramatic pirate captains later associated with her story, James was relatively ordinary. Historical records suggest he worked as a sailor connected to maritime trade around the Caribbean. He was not wealthy, powerful, or particularly famous, but he represented something Anne desperately wanted: movement, freedom from Carolina, a path toward the sea. James had spent years traveling between ports in the Atlantic world. He knew routes through the Bahamas, stories from Jamaica, and the changing political tensions surrounding piracy after the war. Compared to plantation society, his life seemed unpredictable and alive. Their relationship developed gradually through conversations around the harbor district. Anne listened more than she spoke at first, asking practical questions about sea travel, island settlements, and life outside the colonies. James answered honestly. Shipboard life was hard. Food spoiled quickly. Storms killed experienced sailors without warning. Disease spread constantly through crowded ports. Pirate crews fought among themselves as often as they fought anyone else. But despite all of that, The sea still called to her. Over time, Anne and James grew closer. Historians debate how much of their relationship was emotional versus practical, but one thing appears clear. Anne saw marriage to James as an escape route from the future her father had planned. William Cormac almost certainly disapproved immediately. James Bonny lacked the status, property, and stability expected from a respectable match. He was a sailor with uncertain income and questionable connections to Nassau's increasingly notorious maritime world. To a colonial planter trying to preserve his reputation, the relationship represented disaster, which only made Anne more determined. The arguments inside the household became sharper as her father pushed harder for obedience. He reportedly tried steering her toward more suitable men connected to Carolina's planter class. Anne refused every attempt. The tension building inside her life finally reached a breaking point around 1715. That year, Anne Bonny married James Bonny. The ceremony itself was likely small and simple. There were no grand celebrations or wealthy social gatherings. In many ways, the marriage symbolized Anne's rejection of colonial expectations more than her acceptance of domestic life. And for William Cormac, it was unforgivable. According to later accounts, Anne's father reacted with fury after learning about the marriage. Some versions claim he disowned her completely, cutting her off financially and emotionally. Historians cannot confirm every detail, but most agree the relationship between Anne and her father collapsed after the marriage. If true, the decision permanently severed Anne from the respectable colonial world she had grown up in. She chose uncertainty over security, and she never looked back. Soon after the marriage, Anne and James left Carolina behind and traveled south toward Nassau and the Bahamas. That journey marked the true beginning of Anne Bonny's transformation. The Bahamas were nothing like the orderly plantations of Carolina. Nassau was rough, unstable, and crowded with men who lived outside traditional law. Ships filled the harbor, flying flags from multiple nations. Taverns overflowed with sailors spending stolen money almost as quickly as they earned it. Buildings were crude, streets were sandy and chaotic. Information moved through whispers, rumors, and shifting alliances. To many outsiders, Nassau looked like civilization collapsing. To Anne, it felt alive. The pirate presence in Nassau existed partly because imperial governments had lost direct control over the region after years of war. Thousands of former privateers had little interest in returning to low wages after experiencing the profits of raiding enemy ships during wartime. The transition from legal privateering to outright piracy happened gradually, and many crews viewed themselves less as criminals and more as independent sailors surviving in a harsh economic system. Still, the risks were enormous. British authorities increasingly viewed Nassau as a dangerous center of piracy, threatening Atlantic trade. Merchant companies demanded stronger enforcement. Naval patrols expanded. Governors were pressured to restore order. But during Anne's early time there, Nassau remained one of the freest and most dangerous places in the Atlantic world. Life in the settlement was harsh. Food shortages were common when ships failed to return with supplies or prizes. Disease spread rapidly through crowded conditions. Violent disputes broke out regularly between crews. Most structures were little more than wooden huts, tents, or makeshift shelters built from salvaged ship materials. Yet Anne adapted surprisingly quickly. She learned how the pirate economy functioned. Goods taken at sea were traded through smugglers and merchants willing to ignore legal questions. Crews operated under written agreements called articles that outlined how stolen wealth would be divided. Captains often depended on crew support rather than inherited authority. In some ways, pirate ships operated with more internal democracy than many governments of the time. That idea fascinated her. For someone raised inside rigid colonial hierarchy, the pirate world represented a complete reversal of traditional power structures. But Anne's marriage to James soon became strained. Historical accounts suggest James Bonny may have worked as an informant connected to Governor Woodes Rogers, the man sent by Britain to suppress piracy in Nassau. Rogers arrived with royal authority and promises of pardons for pirates willing to surrender peacefully. His mission was simple: destroy Nassau's pirate culture. James reportedly cooperated with Rogers in some capacity, passing information and trying to navigate the shifting political situation safely. Anne hated it. The marriage that once symbolized escape now began to feel like another trap. James preferred caution and survival. Anne had become increasingly drawn toward the energy, danger, and independence of pirate life itself. And then, sometime around 1718 or 1719, she met the man who would make her infamous across the Caribbean, John Rackham, better known to history as Calico Jack. Unlike James Bonny, Rackham carried himself like someone born for the pirate world. He dressed flamboyantly, spoke confidently, and commanded attention the moment he entered a room. His nickname came from the bright calico clothing he favored, an unusual style that made him instantly recognizable in crowded ports. But beneath the theatrical appearance was an experienced pirate captain with sharp instincts and growing influence in Nassau. Anne noticed him immediately, and he noticed her too. Their first meetings were cautious and casual. Conversations near the docks, shared drinks in crowded taverns, stories exchanged while ships loaded supplies under the Caribbean sun. Rackham spoke openly about life at sea, pirate articles, naval pursuits, and the fragile balance keeping Nassau alive under growing British pressure. Anne listened to every word. Unlike the respectable men her father once tried introducing her to, Rackham represented motion, rebellion, and total freedom from colonial expectations. He belonged fully to the world she had spent years imagining from the edge of distant docks. The attraction between them grew quickly, and before long, Nassau itself began to notice. By this point, Anne Bonny stood at the edge of a decision that would change her life forever. If she stayed with James, she might survive quietly in Nassau's unstable political climate. But if she followed Calico Jack into piracy, there would be no turning back. And deep down, Anne already knew which path she was going to choose. By 1719, Nassau had become one of the most dangerous places in the Atlantic world. The harbor was crowded with stolen ships, armed sloops, smugglers, gamblers, runaway sailors, and desperate men who no longer trusted governments or empires. Every tavern carried rumors of treasure fleets, naval patrols, betrayals, and executions. Some captains accepted royal pardons and tried returning to legal trade. Others refused completely and disappeared deeper into piracy. The age of the pirate republic was beginning to collapse, and right in the middle of that chaos, Anne Bonny made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She left James Bonny. Historical records surrounding the separation are inconsistent, but most versions agree the marriage deteriorated badly after Anne's growing relationship with Calico Jack Rackham became impossible to hide. Some stories claim James threatened legal action. Others suggest he attempted to force Anne back into domestic life under British authority. There are even accounts claiming Governor Woodes Rogers himself became aware of the scandal and warned Rackham directly. Whatever the exact truth may be, one thing is clear: Anne chose Rackham, and with that choice, she stepped fully into the pirate world. John Calico Jack Rackham was not the largest or most feared pirate captain of his era. He lacked the terrifying reputation of Blackbeard and the military discipline of Bartholomew Roberts. But Rackham possessed something equally powerful: charisma. He understood how to inspire loyalty, entertain a crew, and survive inside the unpredictable politics of Nassau. He also understood opportunity. While larger pirate ships attracted naval attention, smaller, fast-moving sloops could strike quickly, disappear through shallow waters, and escape before warships could respond. Rackham specialized in speed and flexibility. Anne admired that immediately. According to later accounts, she soon joined his crew aboard the sloop Revenge. At first, some sailors reportedly assumed she was disguised as a man, which was not entirely uncommon in maritime history. Clothing aboard pirate ships was practical, not ceremonial. Loose shirts, trousers, boots, and belts carrying pistols or knives made movement easier during storms or combat. Anne adapted to ship life quickly, and that surprised many of the crew. Life aboard a pirate vessel was brutal compared to romantic legends created centuries later. Space was cramped, food spoiled constantly in the Caribbean heat. Fresh water turned foul after long voyages. Sleep came in short, exhausting shifts, while storms battered the ship through endless nights. Salt covered everything. Clothes rarely dried completely. Rats moved through storage areas. Illness spread easily. But Anne never returned to Nassau complaining. Instead, she proved herself useful. She learned ship routines fast, handling ropes, cleaning pistols, standing watch during night hours, helping prepare sails before storms, watching horizons for naval ships or merchant targets. Pirate crews respected usefulness more than background, and Anne earned acceptance through hard work rather than speeches. The transformation happening inside her was impossible to ignore. The frightened colonial girl watching ships from Carolina was gone. In her place stood someone increasingly comfortable living outside the law. What made Anne Bonny especially unusual was not simply that she became involved with pirates. Women had traveled aboard ships before under various circumstances. What shocked people later was her willingness to participate directly in pirate operations, rather than remain hidden in passive roles. Several historical accounts describe Anne carrying pistols and joining boarding parties during raids. Historians debate how exaggerated some of these descriptions became over time, but multiple contemporary sources suggest she developed a reputation for being unusually fearless under pressure. One witness later claimed she fought like a man, though statements like that reflected the gender expectations of the era more than objective reality. Pirate crews themselves cared less about gender than survival. If someone could fight, work, and remain steady during danger, they earned respect, and Anne did. The Caribbean during this period was overflowing with vulnerable merchant traffic. Sugar plantations across the islands produced enormous wealth for European empires, and ships transporting cargo between colonies became constant targets. Pirate captains preferred vessels that could be captured quickly without extended battles. Long fights risked injuries, damaged ships, and naval pursuit. Rackham's crew operated with speed and intimidation. Many merchant captains surrendered immediately after seeing armed pirates approach, because resistance often guaranteed disaster. A single warning shot across the bow could end a confrontation before bloodshed began. Contrary to modern movies, many pirate attacks relied more on fear than slaughter. Still, violence remained an unavoidable reality of the pirate world, and Anne witnessed all of it. The screams during storms when sailors were swept overboard into darkness, the panic of merchant crews realizing escape was impossible, the constant tension every time unknown sails appeared on the horizon. Life at sea existed one mistake away from catastrophe, yet strangely, Anne seemed more alive there than anywhere else she had ever been. For the first time in her life, nobody expected her to become a respectable colonial wife. Nobody cared about the scandal of her birth. Nobody forced her into polite conversations about inheritance and marriage. On the open sea, survival mattered more than social reputation, and Anne thrived inside that freedom. Her relationship with Rackham deepened during these voyages. Unlike her marriage to James Bonny, the connection was built around shared risk rather than escape alone. They lived the same dangerous reality every day, watching storms approach together, listening for naval cannons in the distance, sleeping in cramped cabins while the ship rolled endlessly through dark water. The bond between them became one of the most famous pirate relationships in history. But another figure was about to enter their lives, a woman even more mysterious than Anne herself, Mary Read. Few people in pirate history have generated more fascination than Mary Read, because her life blurred the boundaries of identity in ways that shocked the early 18th century. Historical records suggest she spent much of her early life disguised as a boy after her mother allegedly hid her true identity for financial survival. Over time, Mary reportedly served as a sailor and even fought as a soldier before eventually drifting into piracy. Like Anne Bonny, Mary existed completely outside the expectations society placed on women during the era. When she joined Rackham's crew, the dynamic aboard the Revenge changed immediately. Anne and Mary reportedly formed a close friendship almost instantly. Later writers exaggerated the relationship in countless ways, but most historians believe the two women recognized something deeply familiar in each other. They were both survivors in a world built almost entirely for men. Together, Anne Bonny and Mary Read became legendary throughout the Caribbean. Sailors whispered stories about women fighting beside pirates during raids. Some accounts were certainly exaggerated by rumor and fear. Pirate stories spread quickly through taverns, and every retelling added new details. But beneath the legends, the reality itself was already extraordinary enough. Two armed women sailing openly among pirates during the height of the Golden Age of Piracy was almost unimaginable for the time, and British authorities noticed. Governor Woodes Rogers had already begun aggressively targeting pirate activity across the Bahamas. Britain could not allow Nassau to remain a permanent pirate sanctuary threatening Atlantic commerce. Royal pardons expired, naval patrols increased. Informants spread through ports, gathering information on pirate movements. The noose around Nassau was tightening. Rackham's crew understood the danger, but continued operating anyway. Some pirates believed the authorities would never fully control the Caribbean. Others simply accepted that capture or death was inevitable sooner or later. Pirate life often burned intensely but briefly. Most captains either died violently, disappeared, or ended their lives on execution docks beneath the warning gaze of empire. Anne Bonny knew those risks, and still she stayed. Perhaps because by then, returning to ordinary society was impossible. She had crossed too many lines. The daughter of a disgraced lawyer from Ireland had transformed herself into something colonial society barely knew how to describe. She carried weapons, sailed with outlaws, rejected marriage expectations, defied British authority, lived among pirates, and according to growing rumors spreading across the Caribbean, she feared almost nothing. But the pirate world was changing rapidly. By late 1720, British forces had intensified operations against pirate crews throughout the region. Warships hunted aggressively through Caribbean trade routes. Governors pressured local ports to cooperate with anti-piracy campaigns. Merchant captains became more heavily armed. The age of piracy was nearing its end, and soon Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and Calico Jack Rackham would face the moment that destroyed their entire world. By the autumn of 1720, the Caribbean no longer belonged to the pirates. For nearly a decade, outlaw crews had terrorized trade routes stretching from the Bahamas to Jamaica. Merchant captains had paid ransoms. Colonies had lived under constant fear of raids. Entire shipping lanes became unpredictable because of pirate attacks. But now the British Empire was striking back with full force. Naval patrols intensified across the region. Governors coordinated intelligence. Informants spread through ports and taverns gathering names, routes, and ship descriptions. The royal pardons once offered to pirates were disappearing, replaced by aggressive hunts designed to make examples out of anyone still operating outside imperial control. The message was simple: the age of piracy was ending. Calico Jack Rackham understood this better than most. His crew continued operating through smaller raids and coastal attacks, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Safe harbors became dangerous. Merchant ships traveled with better protection. Even Nassau itself no longer felt secure under Governor Woodes Rogers and British oversight. Still, Rackham refused to surrender, and Anne Bonny refused to leave him. By this point, Anne had fully adapted to pirate life. The routines that once seemed harsh now felt normal. Sleeping in cramped quarters, cleaning weapons by lantern light, listening for sudden storms during night watches, watching distant sails through salt-covered spyglasses while tension spread quietly across the deck. The crew of the Revenge operated almost constantly under pressure now. Every unknown ship on the horizon could be a naval trap. Every harbor carried the possibility of betrayal, and somewhere in the background of every conversation lingered the unspoken reality that pirate careers rarely ended peacefully. Even so, Anne and Mary Reed reportedly remained among the boldest members of the crew. Multiple historical accounts written after their capture described both women as unusually fierce during confrontations. Some testimonies from surviving crew members later claimed Anne and Mary fought harder than several of the men during moments of danger. Historians caution that some details were likely dramatized after the fact, but the reputation itself became impossible to separate from their legacy. The image of two women refusing to retreat during pirate battles shocked the public imagination across the Atlantic world. And then came the final voyage. In October of 1720, Rackham's crew sailed near Jamaica while continuing smaller raiding operations along Caribbean shipping routes. Compared to legendary pirate fleets from earlier years, the Revenge was relatively small and lightly armed, but smaller pirate sloops often depended on speed more than firepower. That advantage disappeared on the night British forces finally caught them. According to historical records, a pirate hunter named Captain Jonathan Barnett received orders from Jamaican authorities to track Rackham down. Barnett commanded an armed vessel specifically tasked with capturing pirates operating near the island. Late one night, Barnett's ship encountered Rackham's crew. What happened next became one of the most famous collapses in pirate history. Accounts differ on exact details, but most agree the confrontation began suddenly in darkness. Rackham's crew had reportedly been drinking heavily before the attack. Visibility was poor. Confusion spread quickly across the deck as Barnett's armed vessel moved into position. Cannons erupted across the water. Shouts echoed through the darkness, and panic exploded aboard the pirate ship. According to later testimony, several members of Rackham's crew immediately lost discipline under pressure. Some reportedly hid below deck as British forces closed in. Others scrambled desperately without clear coordination. The chaos revealed the dangerous weakness of smaller pirate operations during direct military confrontations. But Anne Bonny and Mary Reed did not retreat. Witness statements later claimed both women remained above deck fighting, while some of the men panicked below. One famous account described Mary Reed angrily firing pistols into the hold itself, furious that crew members refused to come back up and fight. Whether every detail is true or partially exaggerated, the outcome itself is undeniable. Rackham's crew was overwhelmed. The Revenge was captured. And with that moment, the pirate lives of Anne Bonny, Mary Reed, and Calico Jack came crashing to an end. The prisoners were transported to Jamaica for trial under British authority. News spread quickly through colonial ports because the capture carried enormous symbolic value. Pirates had spent years humiliating imperial trade networks across the Caribbean. Now authorities finally had one of Nassau's infamous crews in chains. The public fascination became even stronger once people learned women were among the prisoners. Trials for piracy during this period were swift and brutal. Governments wanted visible punishments that discouraged future piracy. Executions were often public spectacles designed to reinforce imperial control through fear. The accused stood little chance. During the trial, witnesses testified about raids, stolen ships, and criminal activity tied to Rackham's crew. Rackham himself reportedly appeared exhausted and defeated by the proceedings. He understood the likely outcome before the trial even ended: death. And in November 1720, Calico Jack Rackham was sentenced to hang. According to one famous story recorded later, Anne Bonny was allowed to see Rackham shortly before his execution. Historians debate whether the exact conversation truly occurred, but the quote became legendary across pirate history. Anne reportedly told him, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Whether she actually said those words or not, the statement captured exactly how later generations imagined Anne Bonny: fearless, bitter, and unwilling to show weakness even at the end. Rackham was executed in Port Royal, Jamaica. His body was later displayed publicly in chains near the harbor as a warning to other pirates. The Empire wanted everyone to see what happened to outlaws. But Anne Bonny and Mary Reed faced a different situation. Both women were also convicted of piracy and sentenced to death. Yet before their executions could take place, they made a shocking announcement. They claimed to be pregnant. Under English law at the time, authorities could not execute pregnant women immediately. A procedure known as pleading the belly required officials to delay execution until after childbirth. Examinations reportedly confirmed that both Anne and Mary were indeed pregnant. The executions were postponed, and suddenly, uncertainty entered the story. Mary Read never escaped her fate. Historical records suggest she died in prison sometime in 1721, likely from fever complications before giving birth. Her burial was recorded quietly in Jamaica, ending one of the strangest lives of the pirate era. Anne Bonny, however, simply vanished, and that mystery transformed her from pirate into legend. No definitive historical record explains exactly what happened after her imprisonment. Some historians believe her wealthy father may have intervened, using political connections to secure her release quietly. Others think she may have remarried and lived under a different identity. A few theories claim she returned to Carolina and lived an ordinary life, far from the sea, but nobody knows for certain. That uncertainty is part of why Anne Bonny continues to fascinate historians centuries later. Unlike many pirates whose lives ended publicly on execution docks, Anne disappeared into silence. No confirmed grave, no verified final years, no clear ending, just rumors and legends. Yet perhaps that ending fits Anne Bonny perfectly. She spent her entire life refusing to become what society expected her to be: daughter, proper wife, respectable colonial woman. Every stage of her story involved escape from someone else's definition of who she should become. And for a brief, violent moment during the Golden Age of Piracy, she succeeded. The world around her was brutal, dangerous, and deeply unequal. Piracy itself was not noble. It involved theft, violence, and survival inside one of the harshest systems of the Atlantic world. But Anne Bonny's story still resonates because it represents something larger than piracy alone, a refusal to live quietly inside a role chosen by others. That is what transformed her into legend. Long after the cannons fell silent, long after Nassau collapsed, long after the pirate republic disappeared beneath imperial control, people still remembered the woman who stood on the deck of a pirate ship and chose freedom over fear. And somewhere beyond the surviving records of history, Anne Bonny disappeared back into the horizon that had been calling to her since childhood. The sea kept its final secret. The world Anne Bonny once sailed through disappeared faster than most people realize. By the mid-1720s, the great pirate strongholds of the Caribbean were collapsing under military pressure. Naval patrols expanded across Atlantic trade routes. Governors tightened control over colonial ports. Merchant companies demanded stronger protection for their cargo fleets. The brief, chaotic period historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy burned intensely for only a few years before empires crushed it with overwhelming force. The pirate republics vanished. The black flags disappeared from most major shipping lanes, and the people who once terrified the Atlantic world were hunted down one by one. Some died in battle. Some vanished into obscurity. Others swung from execution docks while crowds gathered to watch. But Anne Bonny became something far stranger than a defeated pirate. She became a mystery, and mysteries survive longer than facts. The problem historians face when studying Anne Bonny is that her life exists somewhere between documented history and maritime folklore. Much of what the modern world believes about her comes from fragmented trial records, sailor stories, newspaper reports, and a famous 1724 book titled A General History of the Pirates, written by Captain Charles Johnson, a mysterious figure whose true identity is still debated by scholars today. Some historians believe parts of Anne's story were exaggerated dramatically over time. Pirate tales sold books, filled taverns, and fascinated the public imagination across Europe. Writers often added colorful details to make stories more exciting. Conversations were invented, personalities were exaggerated, events became more theatrical with every retelling. But beneath all the legends, the historical core remains undeniable. Anne Bonny existed. She sailed with Calico Jack Rackham. She was captured in Jamaica, and after that, history loses sight of her completely. That disappearance has fueled centuries of speculation. One popular theory claims Anne's father used his remaining wealth and connections to quietly arrange her release from prison. If true, it would mean the same man who once rejected her may have ultimately saved her life. According to this version of events, Anne eventually returned to Carolina under a different identity, remarried, and lived into old age far from the sea. Another theory suggests she remained somewhere in the Caribbean after her release, disappearing into colonial settlements where records were incomplete and identities could easily change. In the early 18th century, it was surprisingly possible for people to vanish if they moved between colonies with little money and no official importance. There are even legends claiming Anne returned to piracy later in life under another name. No evidence has ever confirmed those stories, and perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why her legend survived, while so many others faded. History often preserves powerful endings, public executions, famous last words, final battles. But Anne Bonny denied history a clean conclusion. She slipped away before the world could define her final chapter. That made her unforgettable. Over the centuries, Anne Bonny transformed into something larger than a historical figure. Writers turned her into a symbol of rebellion. Artists imagined her standing on storm-covered decks with pistols in both hands. Films and novels romanticized her life as a fearless pirate queen fighting against a rigid world. Reality was more complicated. The pirate world was violent, unstable, and deeply dangerous. Disease, hunger, betrayal, and death surrounded nearly every voyage. Pirate crews often operated under brutal conditions where survival mattered more than ideals. There was nothing glamorous about rotting food below deck during storms, or watching injured sailors bleed across wooden planks beneath Caribbean heat. And yet, the emotional power of Anne Bonny's story continues because it touches something timeless: the desire to escape the life others choose for us. Anne Bonny was born into a world obsessed with control. Families controlled reputations, governments controlled trade, churches controlled morality, men controlled nearly every aspect of political and economic life. Women especially were expected to follow carefully defined paths without resistance. Anne rejected all of it, not perfectly, not heroically, and certainly not safely, but she rejected it anyway. That rebellion came at enormous cost. She lost her family, lost security, lost stability. She entered a world where death could arrive through storms, cannon fire, betrayal, or disease at any moment. Every step she took toward freedom also pushed her further outside the protection of ordinary society. But for Anne, returning to the old world may have felt worse than the danger itself. Perhaps that is why her story still resonates centuries later, not because piracy was noble, not because crime was glamorous, but because so many people understand the feeling of staring at a life that feels painfully small and wondering if something larger exists beyond the horizon. Anne Bonny chased that horizon, all the way into history itself, and even now, more than 300 years later, the image remains powerful. A young woman standing on the deck of a pirate sloop somewhere in the Caribbean night, salt wind pulling at her clothes, lantern lights swinging above dark waves, refusing to surrender her life to the expectations of the world around her. The empires eventually won. The pirates disappeared. The ships rotted away. But legends survive differently than kingdoms do, and Anne Bonny became immortal precisely because nobody ever truly captured the final version of who she was. Maybe she died quietly under another name. Maybe she built an ordinary family life somewhere far from the sea. Or maybe, even in old age, part of her still listened for the sound of waves against a wooden hull and remembered the years when she lived beyond the reach of almost every rule society tried to place upon her. We will probably never know. The sea kept that story for itself, and perhaps some mysteries are stronger because they remain unfinished. This has been Biographic Digest. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the forgotten corners of history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. And before you go, let me know in the comments. Do you think Anne Bonny truly escaped pirate life, or do you believe the sea eventually claimed her too? Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories history tried to bury.